John F. Kennedy and the New Frontier. In 1960, we had a presidential election. We tend to do that every 4 years. And this time around, the candidates that were vying for the nation's highest office were the sitting Vice President of the United States, Richard Milhous Nixon, and the young, energetic Senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. The two candidates had a lot in common, actually, when it came to a lot of the issues that they were facing. Most importantly, of course, at this time was how to deal with the spread of communism, the Cold War. But the issues that defined this campaign were not policy issues, but rather those around personality and those around religion. Most noteworthy is the fact that John Kennedy was a Roman Catholic. And you may recall that other than Al Smith years before, no Roman Catholic had ever been nominated by a major party to run for the presidency. And you know from your study of history that this nation has not always treated those of the Catholic faith with respect. And so because of some anti-Catholic bias that did exist within the country, Kennedy's going to have to address that issue. And he's going to do so carefully as he convinces Americans that his faith is one thing and his service to the country is another. Personality-wise, Nixon is kind of serious and buttoned up, whereas Kennedy is young, energetic, inspirational. And this really comes through with television, because this is the first time that there are televised debates. And millions of Americans watch the two candidates debate on TV. Nixon looks uncomfortable, sweaty, tired, doesn't really like the lights, doesn't really feel comfortable in front of the camera, whereas Kennedy felt a lot more natural. And a lot of Americans looked at that and said, that man looks like a president. And sure enough, when Election Day came around, it was an incredibly close election. You'll notice there that the popular vote is separated by just a razor-thin margin. But ultimately, Kennedy is going to prevail there in the Electoral College, besting not only his Republican opponent, but also the independent candidate, Byrd, who represented the more conservative, traditional Southern Democratic voters that are really going to be a thorn in the side for the Democratic president, John F. Kennedy. So who is he? Well, like we said, he's a senator, but he's also a World War II veteran who played upon his service to the nation during that time as part of his campaign. He is young, the youngest president ever elected. Not the youngest president. You'll remember that Theodore Roosevelt was actually younger, but he became president as virtue of an assassination. His domestic policies are bold and ambitious. They're called the New Frontier, but he is going to have very much mixed results, and that's what we're going to focus on today, about where did he truly have success and where did he have failures, and use that to assess the entire Kennedy presidency. And it's on the Cold War that he's probably going to be most well remembered, sometimes for good things, sometimes for bad things. But his entire campaign and his philosophy of government can be summed up in his famous quote given during his inaugural address: "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So right off the bat, though, he's going to have some problems, most noteworthy with Congress. Republicans, they don't like him. Southern Democrats are very suspect of this liberal, northern, wealthy aristocrat, John F. Kennedy. And as a result, many Southern Democrats don't feel any loyalty to them. They felt like his name being on the ballot probably made it more difficult for them to be elected. And so he's going to have to try to navigate a less than friendly Congress. This can be seen when he tries to address the economy. He's going to push for deficit spending, and he's going to push for tax cuts for the wealthy, supply side economics, the idea that if we cut taxes, then that's going to stimulate the economy, raise revenue, all those sort of things. He's not going to get a lot of this done. In fact, he's not even going to get his tax cuts done because Congress looks at a lot of his programs and says it's just too expensive, and we don't want to go along with it. And really, that battle with Congress is going to come to define much of his early months in the White House on issues where he doesn't have to work with Congress, such as establishing the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. He is able to go through with that. This is a commission that studied the inequities that existed within the workplace for women, and it was chaired by the former First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, and ultimately their findings will lead to passage of the Equal Pay Act, which Kennedy will sign in 1963. So when it comes to working with Congress, not a lot of success. When it comes to acting within the executive branch, perhaps a little bit more. When it came to the Cold War, he is going to take a different approach than his predecessor, Eisenhower, did. He's going to advocate for a flexible response rather than overwhelming force and using nuclear weapons like Eisenhower had advocated when dealing with the Soviet Union. Flexible response means we're not going to focus on large standing armies and massive weapons. Instead, we're going to use special forces, counterintelligence, these sort of things. Kennedy is going to focus on using putting money into the Green Berets and those sort of things to try to stop the spread of communism in the developing world. The good part about this is that the United States can fight the spread of communism without committing a massive army. Perhaps the downside of it is that it allows for incremental involvement in many, 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 many countries. That is only possible because of the lack of commitment of large numbers of troops. But those incremental involvement can lead to troop buildup. We see this very clearly in Vietnam, when it is Kennedy who will first send the military advisors to try to support the unpopular government of South Vietnam. To address the threat of communism in Latin America, Kennedy is going to establish the Alliance for Progress to try to use cooperative aid projects, economic influence to get Latin American countries to look favorably toward the United States. But unfortunately, many of the dollars that went down to Central and South America did not trickle their way down to the people who needed them most, and social problems kind of overwhelmed any good the United States might have wanted to do. One of his lasting positive impacts will be the establishment of the Peace Corps. Again, in that famous quote, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," Kennedy is going to inspire millions of young Americans to serve their nation in perhaps unconventional ways. And one way would be through the Peace Corps, where young Americans can volunteer to serve 2 years to travel the world and work in developing nations, in education and healthcare and all sorts of areas. This still exists today. It's still a wonderful way that young people can make a positive impact in the world, and can serve not only their nation, but the world as a whole. Certainly that is one of the positive legacies of JFK. The space race. You'll remember that America has fallen behind the Soviet Union at this time when it came to space exploration. The Soviets are launching satellites. The Soviets seem to be winning this race. And the race for space really was a matter of national pride, but also national security for the United States. If the Soviets were in space, what did that mean for the militarization of space? What did that mean for the advancements that nation had with science and mathematics? And Kennedy says we cannot fall behind. The United States is going to lead the world. That also means we're going to lead the world into space. And so early in his administration, he says that the United States is going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And that was an incredibly ambitious goal given where our space program was at the time. But one of the great things perhaps about the United States is that when it really focuses on a goal, it seems to be able to achieve it. And sure enough, making massive investments in the space program, by the end of that decade, the 1960s, we did in fact put a man on the moon, 1969. So Kennedy will not live to see it, but it does happen. When facing the Soviet Union and the communist world militarily, there's very much some mixed results. The Bay of Pigs fiasco is the first example of this. Kennedy inherits a plan set up by the CIA during the Eisenhower years to train Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow the communist government that had been set up by Fidel Castro. This plan fails miserably. It does not go the way it was supposed to, and it is a black eye for the Kennedy administration and for the United States as these Cuban exiles are swiftly and overwhelmingly defeated. This only strengthens the resolve of the Castro regime and drives them closer and closer to the Soviet Union. In Europe, things aren't much better. After a meeting with Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, hostility between the USSR and the United States increases. Things were not going well. And this is going to lead to the construction of the Berlin Wall that will permanently separate East and West Berlin and will only increase tensions between the free and communist parts of Europe. And of course, the greatest crisis facing Kennedy during these years would be the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October of 1962, the Soviets were discovered to have been putting nuclear missile sites, not sits, in Cuba. And this is a very real concern for the United States. Why? Because up to this point, the Soviet Union did not have a way of ever launching a missile that could strike the United States of America. We were protected by our oceans. That is not true if those missiles are in Cuba, which is only 90 miles off the coast of the United States. When this is discovered, the United States prepares for war. Kennedy immediately orders a blockade of that island, only to then learn that there are Soviet ships on their way to Cuba with more cargo to complete the construction of these missile sites that, if they are finished, would be able to launch nuclear missiles to hit any major city in the United States of America. But Kennedy does not immediately jump into war, instead choosing to negotiate. Ultimately, the crisis is resolved peacefully. The Soviet Union agrees to remove the missiles, but the United States has to give up something as well. What did we have to give up? We had to remove missiles. We had put missiles in Turkey, near the border of the Soviet Union, that could have hit any major site in their country. And we had to agree to remove those missiles. Essentially, we had done to them what the Soviets were trying to do to us in Cuba. We removed the missiles, but the other promise that we have to make is that we would never again try to invade Cuba and overthrow the communist regime that existed there, which is why it existed for decades later and still exists to this day. If John F. Kennedy has any claim to presidential greatness, and that is certainly debatable, it might be for the steps that he took towards civil rights. But it must be known that JFK was rather slow to act and reluctant when it came to civil rights issues. He certainly had courted the African-American vote during the campaign, but once he gets into office, he's not overly enthusiastic to address many of the issues that were facing the African-American community in this country. Now, part of that is probably political. As mentioned before, he has all sorts of trouble with Congress. A huge percentage of his own Democratic Party is in the South and are rather conservative when it comes to a whole host of issues, but certainly when it comes to civil rights issues. And so bringing aboard Southern Democrats was going to be quite the issue. And to bring them aboard for anything was already a problem. So JFK is not going to be overly enthusiastic to try to bring this very touchy subject up. But ultimately, the morality of the civil rights movement is going to move JFK to slowly act on the issues. So first, let's take a look at the Freedom Rides. You know that the Freedom Rides were a series of protests in which black and white protesters, predominantly young people, traveled into the South by bus to make sure that public transit was integrated. And as these buses traveled into the heart of the South, they were met with equally fervent protest. The only difference being that the ones that met them were violent, that townspeople, local officials would attack the Freedom Riders, beat them. In the picture you see there, even firebomb their buses. And it turns into this extraordinarily violent situation. Kennedy, wishing that they hadn't even moved forward, wishing that the Freedom Riders had not gone into the South, feels that he has no alternative, however, to act, and he will send federal marshals to protect them and to try to quell the violence. And that means that by doing that, he has now put himself, willingly or unwillingly, on the side of the civil rights movement. The next year, at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, a young man by the name of James Meredith was attempting to enroll in classes there at the university. Of course, we know from our studies that the integration of public education had been going on for the better part of 10 years at this point, and yet all throughout the South, there were plenty of examples of schools where there were not integrated classes, there were not integrated campuses, and Ole Miss is one of those. James Meredith seeks to change that, attempts to enroll, and when he attempts, there are riots, there are protests. The governor of Mississippi gets involved. They're going to prevent James Meredith from being the first African-American student at Ole Miss. What does Kennedy do? Kennedy has to send in the troops. Kennedy has to quell the violence, and Kennedy has to make sure that James Meredith is going to be able to enroll. Again, slowly but surely moving the ball toward the cause of civil rights. And then finally, in 1963, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization leads a series of marches in Birmingham, Alabama, Birmingham being the largest segregated city in the South, and those protesters were met with violence by police officers, with water hoses, with police dogs attacking these young protesters, and all of this is caught on television. All of this is now for the entire country to see. People who lived in the North, in the West, far away from the South, who had never experienced, had never witnessed The reality of the Jim Crow South now turned on their TV and saw the reality of it. And Kennedy feels compelled to act. That now that there's no looking back, everybody knows what the reality of the Jim Crow South is. Kennedy, in August or July, of that year, will call for civil rights legislation, call for Congress to act to permanently end discrimination on the basis of race in this country. The next month is when the famous March on Washington takes place, where Dr. King gives his "I Have a Dream" speech. As for the legislation that Kennedy puts forward and supports, it gets bogged down in Congress. And who knows whether or not it ever would have passed. Because if passed as prologue, Kennedy is not very effective at getting Congress to do what he wants to do. However, in November of that year, John Kennedy travels to Texas for a series of political appearances, kind of the very, very early stages of his re-election campaign. And it is there, while in Texas, while traveling through Dallas, sitting in an open-air car, that John Kennedy is shot twice by an assassin. He is shot once in the neck area and again in the head. And that, of course, kills him. The assassin's name was Lee Harvey Oswald, a strange man, a loner, who there is still much debate about what his motivations were. When Kennedy is killed, Vice President Johnson is sworn in as President of the United States that day. We don't know a whole lot about Lee Harvey Oswald, his motivation, why he did it, because as you can see in this picture right there, after he is taken into custody and he's been moved from one facility to another, a man by the name of Jack Ruby walks up and shoots him and kills Oswald. And Ruby, a man with ties to organized crime, we don't know why he killed Oswald. There was, other than the fact that he did it. Ultimately, the investigation into it, the Warren Commission, rules that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, was the sole assassin, and he is the one responsible for Kennedy's death. In the wake of his assassination, the nation goes into mourning. You can ask anyone who was alive at that time, and they can probably tell you exactly where they were when this assassination took place. It is a pivotal moment in the history of America. And the nation very much mourns for their fallen president, this person who went into office with high ideals, his new frontier policies, that he ultimately, many of his goals he never realized. And to that degree, some have viewed him somewhat as a martyr, someone who died for a cause. Whether or not that's true is debatable. But what we do know is that after his passing, when President Lyndon Johnson takes over, he certainly plays upon this idea of a martyred Kennedy. And Johnson is going to be far more effective at getting Congress to fulfill policies that were very much in line with many of them that Kennedy attempted to realize but failed to realize. Most noteworthy among them, it will be President Johnson who will finally get that civil rights legislation passed in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Something that it's unknown whether or not Kennedy ever would have been able to get passed had he lived. And then, of course, Johnson will also go the next year to sign into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965, along with a host of other programs that we will talk about at a later time. So there you have it. There is the brief presidency of John F. Kennedy, a man who had many successes, but also a man who did face failure in his presidency and ultimately lost his life, which may have elevated his stature in American history.